Dana L. Wiley Gallery. My name is Dana Wiley, and today we are thrilled to present a gallery talk with Jeremy Long titled Some Ideas About Painting. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this special gallery talk featuring the work of this artist who has not only made a profound impact on I just lost my place, sorry. Impact on the art world and certainly Dayton's art community, but has also shaped minds, inspired creativity, and fostered critical thinking within the classroom as an art instructor. On a personal note, I had the great fortune to have Jeremy as both my drawing and painting instructor when I went to Wright State University. And as with a few of my art instructors, he is one of those voices that are always present on my mind as I navigate through my own experience in this field. So today Jeremy will speak on the paintings of Matisse's The Dinner Table and Fra Angelico's Annunciation, among others. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the talk about these paintings and about his own artwork in the gallery, which consists of oil paintings featuring the exploration of landscape, still life, and interior space. His work draws from the traditions of historical painting while establishing a unique voice that speaks to contemporary experience. Long's mastery of structure and color transforms ordinary moments into immersive visual experiences, inviting viewers into spaces that feel both intimate and fantastic. His compositions with figures and architecture reconcile form and color relationships while using the complexities of modern traditional family life as his subject. So Jeremy Long is an American painter who studied with a number of leading American painters, including Gabriel Lederman, Stanley Lewis, and Wilbur Newald at the Kansas City Art Institute. Long made his first trip overseas in 1996 to paint from the landscape in Rome, Italy for 6 months. After returning to the US, he was accepted into the painting program at American University in Washington, D.C., where he earned his MFA working closely with Stanley Lewis and visiting artist Glenn Goldberg. He has taught at Knox College, Ithaca College, Assumption College, and is currently an associate professor at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. Long has exhibited widely throughout the U.S. and is a member of the Bowery Gallery in New York. Please help me welcome Jeremy Long.
Thank you very much, Dana. It's very sweet. And I'm going to keep this to around 40-45 minutes. It's a beautiful day out, so I appreciate everybody that came on a Sunday. And make sure that, if you have questions while I'm in the middle of doing this, by all means, this is a very informal situation. And when I'm done, I'm happy to answer any other questions that you might have regarding the paintings. Okay. All right, so I want to start with, this painting in particular, for a number of reasons. Now, what I'm going to get into in specifics are, as the title of this thing is, painting ideas. So there's some very specific ones, but in general, I do want to talk about ones that I think everybody can really relate to, which is that everything comes from something, right? Whether you work directly from observation, clearly your motifs or whatever it might be that you're doing is in fact taken from painters of the past that you've been looking at. With regard to this painting, this is by Leland Bell, who's my teacher's teacher, and was somebody I was introduced to when I was a student, because they would speak about him in high regard. He was this legend, as Deborah was saying earlier. And in terms of Wilbur Newald, who was my teacher, they were good friends. So he was somebody that I was very much aware of. So what's interesting is that, aside from being this absolutely wonderful figure painting, the painting itself did in fact come from someplace. Now this is a painting by Balthus called The Moth, and it was one that he had done, I believe, in the early 50s. And Leland was actually friends with Balthus, so he would go on occasion to Paris and spend time with him in his studio and of course was probably more than aware of this painting, and then would return back to the United States, where he would in fact use it as a catalyst, not just for this series, which you can certainly see, but also the moth or butterfly series that he had. I don't have an example of that, but I do want to show you this one. And of course, this painting by Balthus is one that deals with sleep or dream-like situations. He did a series of paintings at the time that deal with the idea of sleep and dream, but not in the sense of, say, for instance, Freud or Jung. He was more interested in things that sort of oppose those ideas. So here's an interesting sort of comparison, as you can tell. Very clear, right? And it goes to show, in terms of painting ideas, that they can, in fact, be something as simple as seeing a situation that you want to take advantage of and put together in your own way. So here we have Leland on the left, Balthus on the right, and here we have actually Piero della Francesco, who of course is early Renaissance, and Balthus on the right, making a sort of a sinister painting about a music lesson. So this is a thing that takes place all the time, regardless of who one might be copying. That goes to show that they in fact hadn't used somebody to their advantage as well. All right, so those are like the big broad strokes in terms of painting ideas. Now specific ones are what are beginning to become more and more interesting to me. And we can all take a look at this painting for a minute or two. It's actually hanging at the Met. It's by Corot, relatively small painting, not much, different from the size that he usually uses. And it was, funny enough, it was a painting that I received via text from Stanley Lewis, about a year and a half ago. He was at the Met, he saw this and sent it to me. And it, got me right away. Not because of the sentimentality of it, but rather the strangeness of it. So if one takes a look at this painting for a few minutes, you can see what takes place is what my old foundations teacher used to refer to as false attachments, right? So these sort of odd things that take place pictorially in paintings that deal with spatial zones that all kind of converge in one place. So in this particular case, this young girl, right, who's sort of looking tentatively at the viewer, has her hands rested on what looks like a wall, right? And very much can be, but it's no coincidence that it slides behind her and sits as a horizontal axis, right, or a horizon line. So this notion of the painting going as far back as one can see being the thing which holds on to the surface in a very sort of literal way. So very strange painting that takes a minute or two sometimes before it jolts and sees this strange, as they say, or as my old teacher would say, false attachment. So, this is something that I've now become conditioned to looking at. So here is a drawing by Bruegel, and he, of course, did these drawings from life, and it says it in Dutch somewhere here, from life, and they were these small chalk drawings. Sometimes he would, continue working on them in pen and ink in the studio, but they were all done from life. And he'd go around and sort of sit behind people and draw them, and these, of course, would be ideas for paintings that he would arrive at later. But they had this kind of strange quality of these people not being seen. And this one, of course, is the one that really got to me. Now, this is a drawing I had not seen before, and my colleague Glenn Sebulash had texted this to me. So, oddly enough, a lot of these images are things that I've received on my phone as a wonderful surprise. But, of course, he and I are very interested in these ideas, and if you take a look at this one, it doesn't take long before it feels very strange, for good reason, and I'll be happy to point out why, but you have a figure that's seated here, and he has along his shoulder a strap of a satchel, and then he's accompanied by clearly a friend who, you know, perhaps they're gossiping about something or whatnot, I don't know, but you know, the size of his head, for instance, is the strange thing. But once you sort of get clued into that, this strap that I pointed out a moment ago feels very much like a shoulder. So the arm, which is holding this hand, begins to be a thing that's shared. So there's what I would say is a compression of space, right, between these two figures to the point where they become transparent, right? And that becomes a very active and exciting situation pictorially. Now, aside from that, there are going to be some examples of things like that occurring that do begin to have specific subject matter reasons. And the two paintings that Dana had mentioned, I'll go into detail and explain what I believe to be those things, but I just wanted to warm everybody up to this sort of funny and strange and exciting kind of thing that takes place. Here we have actually a Bonnard painting. Now this was new to me. I didn't receive this by way of text, but I did send this one to Glenn because I thought it was awfully good. This is a painting that came up for auction not too long ago, so it wasn't one that's been overly exposed. But in looking at it and taking some time, you can begin to see that it has similar qualities to the Bruegel, primarily with this figure that sits in the center, which is to say that, you know, it feels very much like this shape that belongs to that gentleman with the hat, right, is one that seems to want to come forward for good reason. It's this sort of cardigan or sweater like that the figure right in the center has, you know, is wearing that's shared or aligned with that situation. So it has a very similar kind of compression and transparency that kicks right away. It's a thing that once one begins to become aware of that, you can't help but start to move around the picture and find other instances that are of intrigue. And as Bonnard often does, these corners are beautifully activated with heads of figures or sometimes dogs and things like that. So anyways, that's the idea in terms of specific painting ideas that I just want to introduce and begin to discuss at some length with regard to this painting, which is a painting I think most people are familiar with by Matisse as, I guess, his first masterpiece. This is a painting he did right after he was done working with Gustave Moreau. Dates 1897, and it's titled The Dinner Table. And, you know, it was actually a painting as sort of conventional as it might seem now. It was a painting that nobody really liked at all. The family, friends, they all thought that he was going down the wrong path in terms of painting. His paintings during this time, just a few months prior actually, were very tonal and sort of in the tradition of the kind of education one would get in Paris. But of course he was very interested in the Impressionists, specifically Monet. And as you can tell, with regard to all of these objects and the light that's reflecting on them, they have in fact similarities to those cathedral paintings, for instance. And so I never paid a whole lot of attention to this painting. In fact, it was this sort of thing that after having been told that it was, you know, this big painting that became a masterpiece, or at least recognized as one, it was simply a byproduct of his training. You know, the only real comment I ever heard was that, you know, Gustave Moreau was a big fan of it, even though others weren't, and said something to the effect that he could hang his bowler cap on this, craft of wine here at the bottom right-hand corner. But I have a reproduction of this hanging in the hallway over at Wright State in the painting building, and would spend some time just looking at it on occasion. And so what I came to find is that it is a completely unconventional painting, and I'm going to go ahead and begin to explain why that is. One can, in fact, start with the center of the painting and see, for instance, that the model here is arranging a floral situation that has a kind of ambiguity in terms of where it's located in space, which of course relates to the things that I was speaking of just a moment ago. And so that began to, draw me in quite a bit. And the fact that she's leaning over was a curious thing. Even though the thing that she seems to be interested in is sort of behind her. And so that started to kick around this notion of where she was in relationship to all these other things. And then it wasn't long before, after having sort of taken notice, for instance, of where she is, that this curious section here began to get at me. For some reason, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I hope you can see it okay. But I'll go ahead and point out what it is. And then, you may or may not agree with me, but I believe this is the kicker, right? Which is that if one follows this interesting rhythm, this vertical rhythm, all these sort of beautiful crystal objects and crafts, you of course start to see the apron of the maid, right, as it starts to thread its way through and align itself with the neck of this craft. And in doing so, I believe you can begin to feel very much a swing at the bottom here, and this whole section begins to feel very much like a transparent volume, as if she is in a kind of ghost-like quality, advancing forward. It also feels very much like one of those things that one puts over top, like I forgot what they call it in French, but if you go to the diner, for instance, and you get donuts, they have those things, right? So it,
Is it in a cloche?
perhaps, yes, that's good. And so it has that resonance, right? It feels very much like that. Now, those are fun things, but in thinking about this more and more, the model, for instance, I believe her name was Amelie. She was the mother of Marguerite, Matisse's daughter, and she posed for this, and she herself was not a fan of this painting. In fact, at some point, she abandoned posing, and he had to use a dummy to fill it in. But her role in the painting, and I think this is actually tied into it, is that of a maid. And, a maid's sort of, job is to be there but not be there. There's a kind of quality where you're not paying attention to the maid per se, right? They sort of float in and float out. And so that was a thing in which I believe had a connection metaphorically to these clear decisions that he had made in terms of this transparent volume. Now, there's that thing. And then there's something else that even seems clearly, intended, which is that there's this sort of, like I said, conventional perspectival space of the table that goes back, right? And, it's very believable, one sees that, but we get to, for instance, this area right up here, right? And why I point that out is that this wall, for instance, isn't going to be able to run in the same direction as the painting that it's, attached to, right? It should, in fact, begin to run in a perspectival space along with the table, but he's made this decision as a sort of stopgap, right? Not allowing for that space to funnel out. So it's a very, very clear indication that he's not just looking at the kind of academic training that was involved with the French school, and he's not just sort of like doing his due diligence and trying to make a masterpiece to sort of graduate. He's actually beginning to assert a modernist sensibility, right, that's reflecting on everything from, say, ancient art to certainly Cezanne, who he wasn't altogether aware of at the time. So a very, very sort of curious situation there as well as there. And, you know, as I say, I believe these things to happen, right? I'm simply looking at this and seeing these things occur, making a case, or certainly trying to point out as best as I possibly can to all of you that these things exist. So I hope I've done that successfully. All right, so the next painting is by Fra Angelico. Oops, let me just move through here. And neither one of these paintings I've had the opportunity to see in person. I certainly spoke to people that have. Well, Glenn Sepulash, for instance, has in fact seen this, among other Fra Angelico paintings, in this same space. But this, I believe, to be a 10-foot sized or long fresco painting that I think a lot of people are aware of. But it's one that I've looked at for quite some time as well, excuse me, in reproduction. And the thing in which I was beginning to see and become acutely aware of would be these archways, right, that divide the painting. So, you know, here, for instance, you have the angel delivering the news, right, that Mary is about to, you know, give birth to Jesus. And, you know, there's some fun structural things throughout the painting that painters love, right? So, you know, this horizontal axis that moves right down the middle so that these spatial zones, once again, are occupied by a fence to the interior part of this area, as well as going pretty much right through Mary. So you've got 3 or 4 different spatial zones. But, you know, the idea that this thing is in fact divided in 2 began to become something that, you know, one could in fact meditate on, and the fact that each one of these figures is in each one of those separate spaces. So it wasn't until I was looking, for instance, at these archways. Now this one here, right, is a clear perspectival example of a space that one would sort of, you know, experience in real life. But when you move into this one here, even though the references and the color are very much attached to that, it shifts completely. It turns into a kind of convex dome-like shape. So if you just sort of take a look at it independently, one can begin to see that occur. And I'll let you sort of look at that and be convinced just by me suggesting it. But I do believe it to be the case, and I think it's tied specifically into the subject of the painting, which is to say that she has in fact just been told, right, that she's going to be pregnant. And it makes perfect sense that this space above her would in fact feel very much like an impregnated kind of space that billows towards the viewer. I shared this with a friend of mine, and he did say something really quite nice. He said the reversal of the space is a metaphor for her pregnancy. The volume Mary is now projecting outward, while the separate arcade to the left, which houses the angel, recedes. The relationship anticipates the future departure of the angel and the arrival of a child. He's, of course, very much better than I am with words, but I thought, boy, that's wonderful. So that is my take on this particular painting. Anyway, that is what I wanted to share with everybody. And of course, I am more than happy, I don't know how we're doing on time, answer any questions you might have regarding these paintings and the ideas that I believe they possess, or if there were some questions or thoughts about the work here. Yes, David.
The line that looks oddly contemporary, this kind of bar that is holding the columns together or helping to support the arches. That's also interesting in that it is a continuous tie of the 2 spaces
Yeah,
that
sure.
you're talking about.
Yeah.
Though on the left, it receives far deeper. You know, so it's sort of it's like a graphic element that articulates just what you've been talking about.
Yeah, and it's nice that you point that out because I have looked at it, and you know, there's something about the fact that it feels like it's, you know, by way of age and pigment, it's faded a little bit, like an old sort of like boot string or something that's threaded through these architectonic things, you know.
Rebar.
Yes, yeah, rebar, exactly. Yes. And, you know, I should make note of the fact that, you know, I'm interested in all these things and these ideas as ways in which to, you know, figure out what I want to paint, right? And I don't necessarily mean in terms of subjects per se, but in terms of ideas of how to move through a painting and begin to develop a sense of what the subject matter might be by way of a pictorial metaphor like this. Yes.
So we are always talking about, we've been talking about these, like, it's always broad and overarching and like the whole painting, but I'm curious when do you know to choose to add more detail to something or pattern to something? Because I find that I'm always getting lost in like little details and like liking like the little almost uncontrollable nuances of like Mother Nature, I guess. But to be like controlled and choosing when to do that, I have no idea.
Sure, that's a good question, a tricky one in some regards, because I think there's a fair amount of people that like to paint like yourself who are just excited about being able to describe things like the surface of, you know, skin or fabric or, you know, you name it. I'm definitely one of those people. And it is, it's a tricky thing too to know when to indulge in those things. And so I say it's tricky because if one were to invest, for instance, a considerable amount of time painting the hairs on somebody's head or anything like, only to find that, boy, that whole figure needs to be shifted over, you know, 1/4 of an inch or any of these kinds of things. You know, I don't know how long we would last, right, without going completely insane. So, you know, the way in which I've begun to try to organize that is to, in fact, start in such a place that deals almost primarily with large areas that have either very clear sort of responses to these paintings, in this case, a kind of archway, right? So I would point to this study in particular, but there's one behind here that I knew I wanted to latch onto and somehow figure out a way to move into a larger painting that would hold on to that before I indulged, as you were, with all these sort of specifics and how to paint the painting, because I think we all sort of gravitate towards paintings when we go to the museum from a distance, which is to say that they have a quality to them that makes you want to come up to the surface, and then, you know, you want to make certain that you're not disappointed and that when you're looking at the surface, it's just as exciting as it was from, say, for instance, 15 feet back. So that's like a lifetime's work, I think, you know. Everybody seems to have figured out how to do that in their own way. And I believe I'm still trying to myself, but it does have something to do with that impulse of wanting to describe things, yeah.
Can I ask you about the first thing, the motifs?
Absolutely, here yes.
So on the bottom, I think they're fish or something. They're tied together. Can't tell from here. That makes that V that takes you into the.
Yes, well, I'm going to try to see if I'm with you. I don't know if what now? What was it in the middle or the bottom right-hand side of the painting?
It's right in the middle.
Oh, right in the middle. Okay, and you're talking about
No,
that?
I'm talking about It touches the bottom.
Okay, this situation there.
And I see that you have some of that happening in your painting here that I'm looking at, with the dog's legs making that kind of entry point.
Well, yeah, I wasn't conscious of that. And to be completely honest, I'd never spent a considerable amount of time looking at that particular section. And I think, you know, what you say about it being fish is an interesting thing too, because it's not altogether clear if it's pastry or bread or fish or some sort of thing. As it applies to this painting, I guess, I certainly can't take credit for having used that as a catalyst. You know, I think what I was more interested in is a rather conventional thing, which is that I wanted the dog in this particular case to stand right on the edge of the picture plane, of the bottom of
Like the bell.
Well, yes, like the bell, or certainly Assyrian art reliefs, or you know, Egyptian. I mean, I'm just saying things that come to my mind in terms of things that activate that way. But yes, the bell and the bell of this painting, I think both do that. Yes.
Another question is that it's kind of wild when he has everything pushed to the right and this huge empty space, the diagonal that goes
Yes.
through there.
Well, that's, I think, you know, this collection of things here is what maybe made me sort of like, you know, lean into that corner. Because, you know, in all honesty, when I started to look at this painting, I was pushed here, and then I kept spending time on that chair, which sort of felt like a lonely chair, right? You know, and I felt kind of lonely looking at it, you know? And I was like, wow, you know, that's sort of, you know, I know that chair. That's a chair that seems to be familiar with most people, right? I don't own a chair like it, but I've certainly seen, and I think I can remember sitting in one like that. And then I was thinking of it sort of in that darkened area, and then moving from, hopefully into a better mood, right, from left to right, with this light that's just cascading in. Yeah, so I'm, you know, I can only sort of imagine that it had that sort of pinball kind of boom, boom, boom kind of quality that led me down here to really feel like that was the kicker right there. That was a thing that I just couldn't believe when I saw it. It was a very exciting, it still is, exciting sort of moment. Yeah. Yes.
I noticed this with your painting called The Little Shell behind us, and also this one, but there was like this sort of roughness to your paintings, and I was just wondering, is it your brush strokes, or do you, like, when you apply gesso to your paintings when you're doing the beginning parts, do you sand it all fully down?
Oh, yes, so, well, I guess, you know, there's nothing too tricky in the beginning, which is to say that I have certainly, you know, in the case of these paintings, for the most part, not a clue as to what's going to happen. So the way that the support is put together, gesso, is a very sort of traditional method, right? Where, you know, gesso, dry, give it a light sanding, another coat, and then, you know, off to the races sort of thing. I think, you know, these paintings certainly have a surface that differs maybe from the big one, and that has more to do with how these paintings are conceived, which is to say that they are, in the beginning, sort of made almost like non-objective paintings. Just these begin to place, you know, either rectangles or squares in ways that turn into shapes, and then the shapes eventually start to suggest interesting rhythms or spaces that, you know, after I spend more time looking at these things than painting them, it feels like, you know. So a move will be made, right, by maybe an hour, or 5 minutes, been a long time, but a while looking at it and then deciding, oh, that's what needs to be there, I think. So I don't know if that answers the question completely, but the use of the materials is different than, say, for instance, you know, the paintings in the other gallery that were all done from life, where I have a visual resource in front of me that I'm just constantly negotiating and you know, responding to. Evie, yes.
Going off what you're talking about, because you do have so much of a push and pull with shape and color, and you're talking about starting these structures on the surface of the campus, which was kind of my question, because it feels almost like you could build these with just like a abstract drawing and then invite figures or contemporary things we know in. But do you start directly on your campus with just one subject and then you build from there, or is it?
Yeah, I suppose with these big ones I do. Now it varies. So for instance, you know, this one was just that, drawing and sort of filling it in without any sort of, you know, preliminary drawings outside of this. The larger one that's sort of in the back there, that was a painting that I wanted to make based on all the smaller ones that you see hanging there. That, as I said, you know, my friend and colleague Glenn would refer to as symbolist, my symbolist period, how I could somehow, you know, get them into a big painting or a space. And that was a lot of fun to do. So that painting was organized with an eye on that, you know, group of paintings. So it's a bit different in that regard. Where the other big one, that was, you know, very much in the same manner of working on this one, which there really wasn't a sort of clear idea. I mean, there's conventions that are used, but they're ones that I think relate to the painting ideas that I've been talking about. These curious sort of spatial anomalies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yes, David, I'm sorry.
the course of questioning has brought up one element that I think is really clear: the rectangles within rectangles, or the image within the image. And you can see that in the Matisse painting. In fact, even the back of the chair is sort of rectangular.
Right.
And you had identified earlier how the image that is behind the figure identifies the slope of the plane. You know,
Right.
it sort of cancels out or brings it forward. And the Annunciation painting also had in the Mary portal,
Yes.
yeah, the image, which I'm calling an image, or the rectangle in the room behind
Uh-huh.
the figure's head,
Right
behind
here.
Mary's head.
Yeah, yeah.
But also, you know, is it a window or is it an image? It's likely a window, but I want to say that it can, I think it's things like that that have really triggered your building of spaces that you were talking about. It's semi-abstract, you know, I'm starting with the idea of this shape or this form and where does it need to be, and I can really see how these earlier paintings have triggered that in you.
Yeah, well, I think there's some, I appreciate that, David. I think, you know, this idea of frontality, right? The idea of something that, you know, goes against the grain of a sort of believable space is always interesting and beautifully organized with regard to, you know, the Annunciation or any of these other paintings that I've pointed out. And it's just, I guess, turns into a kind of conditioning, right? Where, you know, that's the kind of goal, is to figure out how to pull in and push out at the same time in any sort of fashion. I could keep playing that game all day long, right? Yeah. So I think that's certainly part of it, sure. Yeah.
I have a comment related to that, but it might be a little bit deep, so cut me off if I start like rambling or something. But I'm thinking about how we're commenting on that, like we're looking at these paintings and stuff, and I'm thinking about this timeline of what we used to paint when we start painting now. This is like about a lot of family and stuff. I remember you saying it's about like structure and all that. And I can only help but think about like the timeline of paintings happening. We get inspired by those paintings, right? We build on those ideas, but it just has to become more personal and nuanced because of like just how nuanced things are lately, how present we are. So I just think that, because like religion and stuff is kind of an idea that transcends time in a way, because a lot of people can keep that idea going for a long time. This is almost like legacy, I would say. Like, it is so very personal, and like the stories keep getting told, but it has to be more personal. And then as time goes on, the ideas that are abstracted from this by future people will be maybe even more niche and personal. I'm not sure, but that's just how it's going to go. And in that time frame, in the future, when people are looking at this, they're not going to be thinking about how personal it was, because I don't know. You said, is it Matisse? No, this isn't
Yeah,
Matisse.
no, this is Franz Jericho. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Sorry, I'm not good with my
It's okay.
names. But I don't know how personal this was to that guy, but I can't imagine it was as.
Well, I think he was a monk, yeah. I mean, he was
Okay.
very devotional. It was, and
Right
I
on.
would say too that the reason why it's so great is because he really was a believer. I mean, this wasn't something that he could sort of like just pull out for the trade. I mean, he was, there are various rooms in which monks inhabited in this building that he would make small little devotional frescoes for each one of them. So yeah, that was painted with an enormous amount of purpose and meaning for him. That I think, is certainly that painting was painted with an enormous amount of purpose and meaning. And without a doubt, knowing, for instance, who she was and how she felt about this and this notion of how am I going to put a painting of a maid in this space and what that means is, certainly not done in a casual way. Yeah. But, I think in some ways you're starting to talk about like the idea of humanism versus religion, and it does remind me of this drawing, right? So, clearly Bruegel made some great religious paintings, right? Just ripped from the headlines of the Old Testament and whatnot. But this painting certainly or drawing rather, is definitely a product of humanism, right? To sit down and carefully study these people, right? Whoever they might be, which certainly seems in some cases like everyday kinds of people sitting around, and seeing them from the back seems to be even more intriguing.
So are there any other questions?
Yes,
I'm just struggling with, can you talk a little bit about the difference between these two paintings? Like how in this one, it seems like you make a conscious decision to do more modeling and descriptive form, where in this one you don't. I'm just curious about that.
Sure.
The different way they look.
Yeah.
Does that come first or later? Do you just make
Well,
that decision later?
I was only able to sort of talk briefly about things that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
When it comes to paintings like this, they are, a kind of fascination for me. It's just something that I learned in high school, which was this idea from my art history teacher, who would talk in detail about this notion of a demonstration painting, whether it be, The Raft of Medusa by Jericho, or Courbet's big allegorical painting, and the notion that these guys had to make these paintings that demonstrated, for the purposes of being recognized within the salon, right, that they could do all these different things, whether it be show that they could paint the nude, whether it was that they had a still life situation or a landscape in there, as well as an example of drapery. And then with those two examples that I mentioned, right, they did it in a way that was unconventional, right? So, you know, a rip from the headlines sort of situation with regards to Jericho, you know, turned it into a political painting, right? That was, you know, very important painting for the time and him. So, you know, I've been chasing that for quite some time, and I'm always trying to figure out an opportunity how to arrange a painting. So that modeling or description or the way in which it's painting is in fact something that I am trying to do with those guys in mind, quite honestly. I mean, I've had friends that are painters that said, you know, you should be making paintings like this, but on that scale, right? Meaning they should have this sort of approach, way, and maybe they're right, but I, you know, for now I'm sort of just trying to figure out how to make these big paintings. They're like,
It seems to relate more to your ones in the little room that you do from the wide.
yeah,
I think it's almost a combination of those and your more abstract work.
I think that's fair to say,
Okay.
appearance-wise, yeah. I think the transitions that happen are certainly, you know, much, in most cases, much more subtle, right? Or they hold on to a clear description of a form where, you know, these paintings only suggest that in a lot of ways. Yes, yes, much more flatter, or I guess, you know, and I'm making, I mean, not to defend the painting, but efforts to compress the space as best as I can. And I think, you know, with a longer look, one can find that these paintings have a lot more in common than I think most people see right away.
It's just interesting. Just that painting seems like this combination of your interests.
Yeah. I think that's fair to say.
So that's a conscious decision up front, or like, I want to do one with both elements.
Yeah, in fact, the way it's organized has a lot to do with the way that these paintings are made.
Sure.
You know, and I would just point to these two paintings as evidence of that. And so, how to really sort of, and you know, it in some ways, I believe, isn't much different from, you know, Matisse putting this whole sort of believable space together and then saying, you know, it's gonna not adhere to this. I really find that pretty interesting. Yeah.
The same way your son's T-shirt in the back lines up precisely with the arch of his
Yeah.
so.
I was worried I was a little too emphatic about that, but it would seem like a thing that I had to do. So there it is. Yeah.
And even where they are in space, because Colleen is kind of coming forward and he's going down.
Yeah, no, I did like that. I mean, the larger paintings in the past have had a slightly more recessed space, you know, using still life for the most part as a thing to, you know, set the stage. And then, but I have to say, the kids are getting bigger, right? There's bigger messes. I was certainly looking at how to make a painting that involved like tripping over things all the time in real life. Right? So it seems like it was a kind of natural inclination to pull everything up front a bit.
Do you paint them, their faces from memory, or do they pose for you at all?
They do pose, yeah, and I use photographs as well, and I figure out, you know, a particular point of view that I want to use, and then just go for broke. Yeah.
You also do a lot of drawing, I know, and the drawings are late. I mean, they're drawings like this, and I was surprised that there weren't drawings in the show.
Well, sure. I had a long-term drawing that was used to help push this one along. And a lot of this work is from the Bowery show in New York back in November, but the drawing that I had exhibited, I was certainly fortunate enough to sell. So I didn't have it. At the show in New York, the painting and the drawing are hanging pretty much side by side. So that, I mean, yeah.
Rats.
Yeah.
The other question,
No.
if time's running out, the question you asked about the narrative, the drama, the personal narrative, that's really interesting to me because I think you've abstracted yourself in a way from a very, very personal narrative, and that sort of, to me, that relates to how you're balancing aspects of modernism and aspects of historical painting and historical narrative.
Yeah, I guess there's just a very self-conscious thing about including myself in these paintings, believe it or not. And it's not a decision that I make easily, but it just felt pertinent and keeps, it's like this, there's only been really one painting where I was like, all right, I'm staying out of this one, and I very much probably should try that again, just because it turns into this thing that, I don't know. I don't know if I have an answer about that so much, but it does, maybe it's because I'm only, by myself for the most part making these things, and one needs, all right, this figure has to go here, who's it gonna be, and what happens, so.
I like the personal narrative, and I think I made a comment to you at your opening that to me they're like parables. They're picture stories, and people that are outside of your personal community, family, can easily get inside. Like that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's nice. I mean, I am, I guess. Well, the paintings, they do have an accessibility to them, not just in terms of the appearance, but in terms of imagining situations that take place.
Anyone else? Well, I just want to thank all of you for coming out this afternoon. As Jeremy said, it is a beautiful day outside, so I appreciate you coming in and letting us share our space, and certainly thank you to Jeremy for this wonderful presentation and gallery talk. So